Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by the insightful Alex Krainer, a market analyst, author, and also a former hedge fund manager. So welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you for having me, and warm greetings to your viewers and listeners.
So I wanted to start with this the state of the peace negotiations in Ukraine, because well, this is very important if you're going to normalize the relationship between the United States and Russia, and really normalizing this relationship is, I think, of great importance both to the Americans and the Russians if they want to properly adjust to a multipolar world. But I am always aware that one shouldn't listen so much to what Trump does and says as opposed to what he does. But one can't help but to notice the rhetorical shifts. That is, Trump now doesn't speak about neutral Ukraine. In end to NATO expansion, he talks about a ceasefire monitored by European peacekeepers. He's also now become more, I guess, crude in the language, accompanied by threats against Russia. Now, of course, the new 10 days threats, unclear if he's going to follow through on this. But how are you reading all of this? Is this a reversal to the Biden policies?
Well, I very much doubt that this is a reversal to Biden policies, and I don't really know what Trump has in mind. It's extremely difficult to read because it keeps changing. Trump is particularly reckless in his statements, but I think that the reason for that is that his statements are generally for domestic consumption, and I think it's aimed at various political constituencies that he wants to maybe mislead, deceive, that the actual nature of the relations be below the surface is something else that he's obviously concealing. But I do agree with you that this is an extremely important relation for both sides, and it's extremely important for the whole world because, as it is widely accepted in diplomatic and political circles, the bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia is the single most important relationship for peace in the world and for the future of humanity. And I think that for all his flaws and for all his faults and for all his blunders and mistakes, I think that Trump is very keenly aware of this. So I suspect that the current escalation of his rhetoric is typical Trump, and we've seen it in his first term with respect to North Korea, because as you might remember, there was a period of time when there was this escalating war of words between Kim Jong-un in North Korea and Donald Trump. And, he was calling him Little Rocket Man, and he was saying, my rockets are bigger. Really juvenile stuff, as usual. But it seemed very ominous. It seemed like a war between the United States and North Korea was actually possible. There was a risk that there would be a war. At least that's how it was perceived in the West. But we also found out later that at the very same time, while this war of word was happening in the media, that Trump actually sent a delegation of his representatives and Pentagon generals to China, and I think to South Korea as well, to prepare for a meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un. And then they had that meeting, and it was a very good meeting. And for a little while, it looked like there was going to be peace between North and South Koreas. Trump was the first president to set foot in the demilitarized zone, and in the immediate aftermath of those meetings, we had the beginnings of a demining of that demarcation line between the two countries. So it was a very hopeful moment, which of course was then derailed and sabotaged, as were many other of Trump's policy initiatives. And so, on the basis of all that, I suspect that Trump is now playing the game a little bit differently. He's not his couching his mission in a very thick layer of deception, and that makes it then extremely difficult to read. And deception as such has to be convincing, so you can't give it away. And I think of it as being an undercover cop. If you're an undercover cop in a drug cartel, you have to be very convincing, right? So everybody has to think that you're part of the cartel, and you have to look like the bad guy. So I think this is the case, and I think we'll find out with time, but it's going to take a while. Last thing I saw, and I didn't even have to have time to read it, but I saw, I think on X or somewhere, that Trump was sending Witkoff to Moscow again. I don't know exactly when. I don't know if the meeting already took place or not, or it's only going to take place. But I think that these communications that go through a trusted aide are much more important than what's being spoken to the public and to the media for public consumption. I think we will only know with time, but I tend to be cautiously optimistic because, in spite of the rhetoric, for a very long time, Trump has given every sign that he understands the importance of the relationship with Russia.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, well, Witkoff, I don't think they set a date yet, but it is confirmed that he's going. So
He is going. Okay.
but he hasn't been there in 3 months, so it's gonna be, yes, something might be reviving in the diplomatic sphere, but it wouldn't surprise me because it's a little bit the way Trump talks. It's either insults and threats, or it's flattery. So, she's a wonderful man. They're screwing us. Here's the sanctions. He always. I wish he could find that sweet spot in the middle, but somehow I think this is part of his negotiations. But one side that seems optimistic about more belligerent rhetoric towards Russia now obviously comes from the Europeans, as a goal in its own appears to be to pull Trump closer into the war, into Europe. But this is also why I think the Europeans probably paid that heavy price, or the ridiculous trade agreement. But this could backfire as well, because it doesn't really commit Trump to anything. But what do you think this is gonna do for the Europeans? I mean, what is the role of, for example, the commitment to buy expensive American energy? It's usually recognized that the cheap, reliable energy is the foundation of any functioning economy. So, what is this going to do to Europe?
I think that ultimately, as I put it in an article that I published recently, I think this is the moment when the European Union struck the iceberg, to use the Titanic analogy. This is problematic on several levels. Well, first of all, the commitments that Ursula von der Leyen made to Trump are simply impossible. I think that it's so far beyond anything halfway reasonable that it's not going to happen. It's going to unravel. But what it's going to show is that European Union has no legitimacy. The $750 billion in energy resources, this is multifold of what Europe is already importing from the United States now. So there's no I don't even understand where this energy is supposed to go, what purpose it would serve, because it's so much that I'm not sure that the European Union can even afford this. Then, it raises the question, well, what is Ursula von der Leyen's legitimacy to even conclude this kind of a deal? And as we're finding out, she doesn't have any. And then the commitment to invest $600 billion into the United States of European Union's money, which they don't have, and then to buy an undisclosed but vast amount of US weapons. These are all commitments that it seems to me were made in desperation for the purpose of keeping the United States on board as an ally with the EU and Western Europe, including Britain, and so, Trump is playing them because he wants to extract this tribute from them. And obviously they're desperate enough to agree to virtually anything, but it's going to cause a lot of strife in the European Union. I think that ultimately it might start the process of disintegration of both the European Union and the NATO. Individual countries are not going to be able to commit to any of this. I think that Germany, Poland, Hungary, sorry, not Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, Serbia, they all want cheap Russian gas. They don't want expensive American gas because Russian gas is cheaper. It's more abundantly available, and it's more reliable if it comes through pipelines than if it's delivered on ships. It's very clear that with expensive energy, European industries lose competitiveness. They already lost competitiveness. Add expensive energy to it. Add 15% tariffs. Add the fact that the euro appreciated against the dollar since Trump came into office by some 10%. And suddenly, American goods are much, much more affordable on European markets, where we get them at 0% tariff, whereas European goods on US markets are now much, much less competitive. So it's going to accelerate the process of industries moving their production elsewhere, to the United States, to Mexico, to China, or wherever else. But it's turning Europe into a museum and a tourist destination with no industries. So it's, I think, more than sanctions, tariffs, more than a trade deal, it has been a blow, maybe a lethal blow, to the legitimacy and the future of the European Union.
Yeah, no, this certainly they're not the union that's able to negotiate from a position of strength anymore. I think this is out the window, and there appears to be some rebellion among the actual member states who have some very unflattering words to describe the deal. So humiliating, subordinating. This is hardly something that's celebrated. But at the same time, the EU argues that, well, this isn't really all about trade. This is about the wider transatlantic commitment. So if we just a little bit, if we subordinate ourselves a little bit, make ourselves economically attractive partner to the US, someone to extract from, then America will take care of us and they won't leave us. Or as Secretary General Mark Rutte would say, daddy won't leave, he will keep the family together. So this is the spineless language we have reduced ourselves to, it appears. But what would be the wider ramifications? What would you expect to see now in the European markets, except for this decline of and lack of access to cheap energy, you would have an economic decline, deindustrialization. But what do you expect? What are the challenges in, well, let's say the financial sector with the banks?
Well, for once, it seems to me that the markets have interpreted this event correctly, because so this meeting on Trump's golf course, where I also meant to say, the symbolism of Trump meeting with Ursula von der Leyen and Keir Starmer at his own private golf resort is I think remarkable. He didn't come to 10 Downing Street. He didn't go to Brussels. He summoned these people to his place of leisure, to his own private place of leisure. I think that's also a humiliating slap in the face to the European leaders. So, there's no respect there. There's a certain degree of contempt, because he could have flown into London, he could have flown into Brussels to meet these people. He chose deliberately to bring them to his golf course. Okay, so the markets, this happened on Sunday, right? And then on Monday, when the markets opened, the euro was trading close to $1.17, a little bit more than that, $1.17.50, let's say. And the British pound was close to $1.35. Right now, the euro is below $1.14, and the pound is below $1.32. So that doesn't sound like a big difference unless you understand how the markets work. But this has been a very, very significant pullback in the value of those currencies. And I suspect this is going to continue. And something that I've been predicting for a very long time is that the British pound and the euro would ultimately collapse, which is something that doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process. But I think we're certainly going in that direction. As the currencies weaken, the interest rates go up, the inflation ramps up, and as European powers and Great Britain lose the control of global events, and especially these extremely important theaters of war like Ukraine and the Middle East, they will have no choice but to resort to central bank printing money to pay the bills of the government and of their zombified corporate world. And that inevitably accelerates the process of inflation, of the price inflation. And I think that what we're going to see well, it's always thankless to try to predict when this could happen, but I would say over the next couple of years, you're going to see a process of decline and collapse similar to what we've seen in the early 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed. Officially it was in 1991, but the process of decline already started in the 1980s and even in the late 1970s. Or something like we saw in the Weimar Republic, when after World War I, the German decline started first very gradually, but then in the early 1920s, 21, 22, 23, there was an acceleration and a very, very sharp, rapid collapse. And so I think that Great Britain, European Union, and probably Japan as well, are going in that direction. And on the back of that, I think that Trump is not forgetting Canada. He wants Canada. He's dead serious about that. And so that puts him on a collision course with his bestest friend and ally, the United Kingdom. And then there's also Greenland, which will be a problem with Denmark and the rest of the European Union. But I think that's all coming.
Well, as the economy is, it's very hard to argue that the European economies will do well in the coming years. I think, as you said, this could be a Titanic moment. I do think the cutting themselves off the energy and destroying Nord Stream obviously was very destructive, but this piles on and makes it more permanent, it would seem. But what does this mean for the security architecture of Europe? Because NATO has always had this quid pro quo in which both sides aren't 100% comfortable. That is, the Europeans will subordinate their foreign policy a little bit to the United States, and the US will pay for our security. So essentially buying some influence. But through the years, there's always been some tensions. That is, the Americans would like the Europeans to pay a bit more, and the Europeans has this aspiration for some strategic autonomy. Some, they call it European sovereignty. In other words, a little bit more independence from the United States. Well, now we have this strange situation where the US will not be paying for the security. Instead, they're extracting massive resources now from Europe. America, in return, doesn't really have the intentions or the capabilities to protect Europe as they did in the past, as they now have different priorities and amount of resources. But also the Europeans, how long can this humiliation act, continue? They certainly, uh, if there's nothing being delivered here, where's the purpose for the Europeans? At some point, they would have to reconsider the security architecture as well, because as long as the war against Russia continues, they will have to be subordinated to the United States. So, how do you see the future of NATO once we could continue down this pathway, especially now that we're looking that NATO is losing the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think that NATO doesn't have any future, and I think that the desperation is reaching such points that they're discussing opening new war theaters to keep themselves relevant, as we saw with, Lieutenant General Christopher Donahue fantasizing about invading and capturing Kaliningrad. What for is very hard to discern, other than if we start something like that, well, of course, the United States is going to come in and back us up and support us. But the reason why you would do this to begin with are not very clear, other than the desperate need to make themselves relevant. And on account of European Union's humiliation in the U.S. trade deal, it has to be said, it's not just Trump. This is not the only humiliation that the European Union suffered in the last month, just the last month. It's been one of the three. So first, about a month ago, at the beginning of July, we had the meeting between Kaja Kallas and the Chinese foreign minister, where she thought it appropriate to start lecturing him about European values and democracies and so on, and demanding that the Chinese distance themselves from Russia over Ukraine and so forth. And they really angered the Chinese delegations. And then later in the month, I think it was 24th July, Ursula von der Leyen with her delegation came to Beijing, and this was 25th consecutive EU-China summit. And it was supposed to be an occasion to celebrate 50 years of diplomatic relations between China and the EU. But the Europe, again, same thing. Ursula von der Leyen opened with lecturing the Chinese about human rights, demanding that the Chinese cease supporting the Russians in Ukraine, stating that right now, the relationship between Russia and China over Ukraine is the determining factor in the relations between the EU and between the EU and China. And what happened is that the Chinese, Xi Jinping, requested that the summit be cut short. So after one day, they asked the European delegation to leave, basically, China. And then the Qataris, who are now the most important supplier of non-Russian gas to Europe, well, they threatened that they would cease supplying the EU with gas because the Europeans are imposing this thing called Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence requirement. It's some sausage CSDDD directive that they impose on large suppliers and businesses in the in the European Union, and this imposes the obligation on companies and Qataris to investigate and fix problems related to environment, climate, and human rights. And so it's just simply an arrogant, hubristic overreach that for some reason Europeans feel they are entitled to demand from everybody. And so they've antagonized the United States, they've antagonized China, they've antagonized Qatar, they're antagonizing everybody. And so my conclusion is that not only in terms of economic development and trade, but also in terms of coming up with a new security architecture for Europe, it's not going to be the current leadership. I don't think they're going to change course. They're going to continue straight ahead because they appear to be ideological zealots until they're swept out of power. And they're going to blame Russians, they're going to blame Trump, they're going to blame the Chinese, they're going to blame anybody except themselves, and they will not alter course. So I think that what's going to happen is that these globalist networks of power are going to become increasingly weakened, and we're going to see strengthening of the sovereigntist movements, as we're already seeing, like Marine Le Pen, AfD, Robert Fico, Viktor Orban, and so forth. And I think that ultimately individual nations are going to be looking for an alternative security architecture on their own. But I think that inevitably they're going to have to default to Russia and to the probably Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because they have already defined an alternative security architecture. And becoming a member of BRICS, becoming a member of SCO, it's going to be a lot more attractive given the surreal course of events in the EU right now.
Do you see what is breaking NATO and EU though? Is it ideology or just a failure to adjust to multipolarity?
I think it's primarily lack of legitimacy. NATO was created, and the very creation of NATO is a very, very disputable, because NATO was created in 1949, if I'm not mistaken, and it was in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The Allies, which was the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, just defeated Hitler and the Nazi Germany. So they should have been friends and allies. But the British had they had different plans. And so, in 1946 already, the World War II barely ended. Winston Churchill went ahead and made his famous Iron Curtain speech, in which he basically declared the Soviet Union to be the enemy of the West for no reason, for no justifiable reason whatsoever. And he did it in front of President Harry Truman. And so from that moment on, the West started to organize a bloc opposed to the Soviet Union and the communist bloc. And there we got NATO in 1949, and then in 1952 it was expanded. And then after I think in 1954 or 56, after NATO added Western Germany, only then the Soviet Union formed the alternative Warsaw Pact. But this whole, you know, this whole creation of two blocs and starting the Cold War, it was contrived. It wasn't necessary. It didn't have to be that way. And then especially in 1991, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, then NATO no longer had a reason to exist because it was created as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, against the communist, to contain the communist world. And in that way, I guess it had some kind of legitimacy, at least in the public mind. But once the Soviet Union collapsed and there was no more communist world, because Russia is not a communist country, none of the former Soviet republics or Warsaw Pact members are communist countries. NATO no longer has a legitimate reason to exist. And so I think that the lack of legitimacy is what's going to finally lead to NATO's demise, and also their despair now to keep themselves relevant. And they're doing so by escalating war tensions, not just in the Baltic states, with this threat that they're going to overrun Kaliningrad, but also, there's events happening in the Balkans where it does appear that certain interest groups, particularly the British foreign policy establishment, want to open the Balkans as the next front for in the clash between the West and Russia. And I think that increasingly countries are realizing what's going on, and they're not on board. And so now you have this famous Article 5. It appears that if NATO invokes Article 5, there's going to be a lot of countries that are going to say, like, sorry, no, we didn't sign up for this. You're not defending us from an invasion. You're actually instigating a war that we don't want to fight in. And so if the United States is no longer on board wholeheartedly, they're on board in the sense that they want to sell a lot of weapons to the European Union, but they're not really interested in fighting a war against Russia. If Hungary is not interested, if Croatia, Slovakia are not interested, if Romania is not interested, if Poland is not interested, then what's the point of NATO? It's just going to become a completely ineffective organization. It's going to be a debating club. They're going to be issuing statements. They're going to do trash talk and try to come across as tough and credible. But if you throw a party and nobody shows up, then you're no longer in the game.
The desperation now is states always get very dangerous when they're desperate. But
yes,
already back in January, you had the Atlantic Council going out arguing again, the mouthpiece of NATO, that Trump should go out and call for the demilitarization of Kaliningrad and even possibly push towards independence, so it could be part of the European family of nations. This was the but all this soft language to mask what it would mean, which is the invasion and annexation of a large chunk of Russian territory, is quite radical. But the fact that they're speaking so casually about this is something that worried the Russians since the 90s, especially since 2004, when the Baltic states became part of NATO, thus completely encircling Kaliningrad. But it's one hopes this will only be something for mad people in think tanks. But the fact we now have American generals openly speaking about this is this would have a nuclear response from the Russians also. But My last question is just something actually I asked Putin back in November, which is if to what extent can BRICS possibly appeal to Europe in the future? Because a key problem in Europe, of course, is that after the Cold War, by expanding NATO, we essentially revived the zero-sum bloc politics of Europe. So you're either in or out, and we compete for the borderline states, so Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, and but BRICS has a different format. It doesn't do this bloc politics. It takes adversarial states in, so it can bring in UAE and Iran. It can have China and India. So it doesn't build on the same alliance system. And I was wondering to what extent a similar format could be used in Europe. This question seems more relevant now that the EU fails to deliver on this economic prosperity. NATO fails to deliver on anything that can resemble security. Do you think BRICS countries in Europe could jump ships and consider BRICS besides Turkey, of course?
I think that this is inevitably coming. It's hard to envision today, and it may, certainly it won't happen overnight. But I think it's inevitably coming because the European Union is already disintegrated under the weight of its own contradictions and incoherence of its policy. And, it's rigidly attached to these certain policies, and it will not alter course. It's already becoming increasingly unattractive to the member nations. And I think that even without Brexit, even without actually formally exiting the European Union, they're starting to forge ahead with their own policies, and let's say no longer adhering to European directives as rigidly and as zealously as they might have before. I suspect that, as with, as a supranational entity, European Union will collapse at some point, I would say within the next 10 years, in a similar way as the Soviet Union did. And then individual nations, obviously not under Macron and Friedrich Merz and these types of people, but under new leaderships, like, if you had Călin Georgescu in Romania, or you had Marine Le Pen in France and so forth, then they would consider this because, the BRICS is a very wealthy, powerful trading bloc. And, Vladimir Putin already since the mid-2000s has been talking about multipolar integrations from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And so I think that for questions of economic development, for questions of security and trade, it'll be attractive to everyone to consider joining the Belt and Road Initiative and the BRICS movement. And I think that because the European Union will not alter course and provide an attractive alternative, I think that with time we're going to see countries jumping ship, and at some point we're going to get, the equivalent of the Belaveja Accords, in 1991, when the representatives of Soviet republics got together and declared that Soviet Union is no more. At that point, Soviet Union had already disintegrated. They just formalized it at that point. And I think that something like this is going to happen for European Union and individual countries, one by one, probably led by places like Slovakia, Hungary, Italy, Turkey, maybe Romania under different leadership, are going to start opening negotiations with BRICS, and we're going to see a transition that's going to change the situation on the old continent.
Well, as I said, it seems difficult to imagine now, given the state of relations. But as the old institutions begin to fade away, as they no longer serve a purpose and indeed become a burden, it's not that many other alternatives which have been established. So it does appear that these kind of institutions, this Eurasian institution, which the Chinese, Russians, other are developing, would be the most attractive alternative. So, anyways, thank you so much for your time. It's always great to get your insights. So, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Always a pleasure to join you.